we need to remove then these plastic retention brackets. So then let us get rid of these retention clips and also remove it from the back side. After you have removed the 4 screws, then you can just pick up these plastic retention brackets. Most probably it's a good idea to save this, because you might just sell the board or you might change your cooler in the future, and then you might need these screws and this plastic. But anyway, we also need to then remove the original stiffening plate, which is at the bottom of the motherboard. To remove this stiffening plate, in my case, if I just lift the motherboard, it just literally falls out. So this is this metal plate, which comes with the AMD motherboard, or at least with this Gigabyte motherboard. It's overall not a bad stiffening plate, but yeah, I mean, Thermalright chose to use a even bigger stiffening plate, so yeah, that's why we need to remove this one, because this is not mechanically compatible with the Thermalright cooler. I will just put then this whole plate and this plastic retention brackets into the original box in which the motherboard came in. So if I sell it later or I use it for something else, then I still have the bracket and these plastic things. So next we're gonna need to prepare this stiffening plate for this Thermalright True Spirit cooler here. And in order to do that, we're gonna need this metal bracket which came with the cooler. Then we're gonna need this plastic insulation foil, which we're gonna put on this metal bracket. Then we're gonna need 4 of the longer screws. This is why I'm showing here 2 screws, that you see the difference. So as I mentioned, some of the screws are longer. You're gonna need 4 of the longer screws. Then you're gonna need also 4 of these small plastic thingies, like spacers, which we're gonna have to put on this metal. And then we're gonna need also 4 of these. At the end of the day, this is just a spacer which will be sitting between the motherboard and this top plate here, this one. In addition, I nearly forgot, we also need this small black plastic square, which will drop into the middle of this metal stiffener, and then this serves as a spacer between the metal and the bottom of the motherboard, because there are lots of capacitors and all other components below the CPU, which we definitely don't want to touch with a metal surface. Now this metallic stiffener and this plastic need to be installed on the back side of the motherboard, from which we have removed the standard AMD stiffener bracket which came with the motherboard. So then this will sit roughly here, and then this small black plastic square first of all have to be then inserted from below. And this, as I mentioned, should be a spacer between these capacitors and the metal. However, actually I found that either this piece of plastic was not made according to the socket specifications, or this motherboard didn't really respect the specifications. Namely, I found that if I would be using the standard plastic which is given with the cooler without modifications, then actually I found that those capacitors on the side, so these two, and also these 2 capacitors here, they were actually not sitting below this plastic. So the plastic was pushing on top of them, And that should definitely not be the case, because that means that when we screw in these 4 screws and we tighten them, then we're gonna mechanically break those capacitors. That's no good. This plastic shroud should be around the capacitors, not touching them at all. In order to mitigate this issue, I don't know how well you can see it on the camera, I actually took an X-Acto knife and I removed roughly about, I would say a 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter of plastic from these 2 sides of this small plastic bracket. And now, so you see now this side is slightly bigger. So if I insert now this plastic on top, then I can see that there is no issue anymore with the capacitors. All the capacitors are below or next, they are not touching this plastic. So I even have a little bit of room where I can have some room when I screw in the screws. You know, this is not gonna stay in the same position, it will move 0.5 millimeter back and forth. And now it is just fine. So this is really a word of caution. If you are building this type of cooler, so this True Spirit 140 on this Gigabyte 990FXA-UD5, if I remember correctly, motherboard, then really fix this, because you're gonna mechanically break the motherboard and your system will definitely not boot. So take care of that. So then to put this bracket together, I don't think you can see this on the camera, but these holes are drilled such that on one side they are more like, V-grooved, and on the other side they are completely flat with this metal piece, which tells me that most probably this flat side needs to sit on the motherboard. Okay, so if this is the flush side, then goes down on the motherboard side, then we're gonna need this plastic below this metal so that it insulates the motherboard from the metal. And then finally we're gonna then need to put this plastic inside this thing, but I need to think which were the sides which I modified with the X-Acto knife. So these are these 2 sides, I can see it. This is why I put those sides there, because as you remember, the capacitors are somewhat asymmetric on the board. So as you see here, the distance between these 2 capacitors is a lot smaller than from these 2 capacitors. So it means that when I put this plastic on, then I have to put it such that these grooves or these places which I removed with the X-Acto knife then come like that. And I can check visually as well that now the plastic is not sitting on top of the capacitors, and you can even slightly move it a little bit, which is just fine. Once we have this sandwich made out of the metal with this plastic and with the black plastic square, then now we're gonna need to install these small white plastic spacers. As you see, one side is larger than the other. So the smaller side then will be inserted into these 4 holes on the motherboard. Once they are inserted, now we can put this whole thing on top of it, and then once we nicely align it, then we can screw it temporarily down. Now I then take the 4 longer screws and then I screw them in. Well, it was a good theory that we can just screw this screw in, Actually, what I found is that you cannot really do it, because then this plastic spacer below will just freely rotate. To make our life easier, what I will do is just simply remove the whole thing, and I know that then these are the 4 holes where the screws need to be screwed in and where the plastic spacers need to sit. So I just remove this whole thing, rotate it around, and now with my hand I can easily screw them in, and once I'm done with all 4, I'll be back. So as expected, if you do this when it is not on top of the motherboard, then it is a lot easier. So I find this way more practical. And at this stage, then again, let me check. So these are the sides which I cut out with my knife. So then this is how it comes on the motherboard. And yeah, so this is how it would sit. And now we're gonna turn the motherboard over and then screw in 4 of these metal spacers. So then let us turn the whole motherboard over. I will just hold it down with one of my fingers. And here we go. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, fine. So you have 4 of these small plastic spacers pushing through somewhat through the motherboard. And then of course 4 of the screws, the tips of the screws are also on top of the motherboard. So now we're just gonna take 4 of these metal spacers. Again, I repeat, with the plastic towards the motherboard. And we just nicely screw them in. Once you have screwed all 4 of these metal spacers with the plastic part down towards the motherboard on, I still found that they are not really well tightened, because these screws on the other side of the motherboard are just freely rotating on top of these wide spacers. So what I will do, I will just then rotate a little bit the motherboard, and then with the screwdriver hold the screw, and with my hand then I will just tighten these 4 screws. After I have tightened the 4 screws, then I have inspected visually that this black plastic is now fine. It is next to the capacitors and not on top of them, which is important. Also that all these 4 white plastics are sitting nice and flush with the motherboard. That this metal retention or stiffener is not touching the motherboard, which it would not be a good thing. So this is floating about 2 millimeters above the motherboard. And then also I checked that on all 4 of these screws I have, or spacers, I have the plastic part pointing towards the motherboard where there are the traces on the PCB. As a next step, we have to install now this retention bracket on top of these spacers. For this we're gonna use 4 of the smaller screws which came, or not smaller but shorter screws which came with the True Spirit 140 cooler. So you just fit this bracket on top. Again, if you check, one of the sides is cut more flush or drilled more flush. I will put that on the top of these spacers. I must say I'm not loving the way how this is mechanically sitting here. I mean, come on, would have been really so expensive to have it just 3 millimeters or 4 larger. So there is an actual hole here where I can drill in or screw in a screw. What I mean I'm not loving about this mechanical design is that literally this bracket is held only by the portion of the top of the screw. So you see there is this cutout and the screw comes only around right there. So it means it makes mechanical contact with about 2 millimeters of the metal, which is, come on, I mean, do you really want to save 50 cents, just make this plate a little bit larger? Like you see, there are these screw holes here. I mean, these are the proper thing. When you screw in a screw here or here, you can be that sure that it doesn't matter how much this plate will bend, the screw will never, be released. Whereas in this case, I don't know, I mean, if you would take this thing on a LAN party as an example, I would suspect that when you move the PC and you make it a little bit of shake, I would suspect that this just literally breaks loose. I mean, yeah, that's why I don't like this design. So once we have this bracket aligned on top of these 4 metal spacers, then we just put in the 4 shorter screws. So once we have now this retention bracket screwed on top of these 4 spacers, so it's not really going anywhere. Hopefully it will not bend that much that it will pop off when I'm really screwing in the cooler. We will see. It shouldn't. Anyway, it's time now to prepare the actual cooler. So I already put in 4 of these plastic triangles on 4 of the corners. This is to reduce the vibration coming through from the cooler. Then next we need to install 2 of these, I mean, again, they are like a sort of retention spring, with which then we can install the cooler next to the heatsink. So what you need to do is you need to then put in these retention clips or springs, who knows what they are, into these small holes. So if you are using only one cooler, then you will use the hole closer to the cooler side, because there are holes on the other side as well if you would use 2 coolers in a push-pull configuration. Anyway, so you just, let me show it from the side. So you just literally push them in, if they go in, hopefully, yeah. And then you will do the same thing on the other side as well. And now you have then this thing which moves to the sides. So now I have both of these retention springs attached to the cooler. Notice that it has to be installed such that this kind of bend is pointing towards the heatsink. So when you put the cooler here on top, then this will latch to the cooler, and then through the spring force will hold the cooler on top of the heatsink. Now at the next step we need to then prepare the surface of the CPU and also the surface of the heatsink, because first of all the CPU is definitely dirty, and even if you buy a completely new CPU, most probably you're gonna touch it some way or another with your finger. Eventually if you're wearing gloves, then you might get away with it. It's always a good idea to clean it with, I use isopropyl alcohol. And also it's a beginner's mistake to leave this plastic on top of the cooler or the heatsink, I'm sorry. So no, this is supposed to be definitely removed. There is even an explicit statement here, warning, please remove this label before you use it. So yeah, I mean, that is just for those people who don't eventually know what they are supposed to do with it. So do not install it with this plastic on. That's a really, really bad idea. Why this plastic is on, so I will peel it off. It's because, look at that finish of the heatsink. I mean, this is like a mirror, literally. It's really nice, actually. So even though this retention bracket, I'm not loving it, the mirror finish on the cooler itself, it's pretty good. It's high quality stuff, I like it, so hopefully it will perform rather well. Nevertheless, I'm gonna clean the surface with a bit of alcohol and with a cotton bud or with some tissue paper as well. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to look at that. You can literally see the lens or the reflection of the camera lens of the Canon what I'm using. And I must say that so far, none of the coolers which I normally put on had such a high quality finish. I mean, this is something definitely a good stuff about this manufacturer. And I would say that this is one of the reasons why this cooler is performing rather well, at least according to the tests. It is really doing a good job, which means that it is really sitting flush with the CPU and it can maximally transfer all the heat from the CPU core. After I cleaned the CPU and also the heatsink, the bottom of the heatsink with isopropyl alcohol, now is then time to apply the heatsink compound. I find this Gelid, or I don't know how you pronounce it, anyway I will call it Gelid, Gates A2 heatsink compound rather good, at least for the price it does a good job. It is a silver containing heatsink compound, so next to the silicone, it also contains small silver particles to improve the heat transfer, which means that it is not really a good idea to put it on top of electronics. Even though it has a rather high resistivity, it is still a better idea not to put it anywhere around the socket and so forth, because it might short out components. Even if it doesn't, I can tell you that removing this thing or washing it out from something, it's a nightmare, if not impossible, because of the tiny silver components. So don't get this on your clothes, because yeah, I mean, you can pretty much throw the shirt away. The size of the AMD CPUs is rather large, so we cannot go and try to save the heatsink compound. Normally for the old Intel Pentium 3 and Intel Pentium 4 was enough to put a small dab on the middle of the CPU. These CPUs are roughly this size, so it means that normally what I do is that I'm putting small dabs. I really mean small, so these are not even rice, but like 1/4 of a rice bead, because when you put on the heatsink, then you will screw it down and that pressure will literally push out the heatsink compound. So it means that if you put it here within this area which is like written, it will be just fine. You don't need to put a thick coat on the CPU. No, the heatsink compound is just a thin layer which is sitting between this metal and the other metal, and it is just supposed to fill in the imperfections between the two metal parts. So I'm just putting again small dabs. So the thing is that why I'm not using a larger dab in the middle is because this is a really thick heatsink compound, and I found that even if you press it down with the cooler, it often just stays in a small area. So this is why I like to distribute it better and leave it from the very beginning as a thinner, distribution. So then this is roughly normally what I do. So I distribute it really, really thin with the syringe as it comes. So I just slightly touch the top of the CPU and I very, very slowly push the compound out. And as I mentioned, I don't really go next to the side of the CPU, because this will be anyway pushed out. You can often see people use, like credit cards to smear them and so forth. I mean, come on, there is no need for that, because the pressure will do a better job than you can ever do with a credit card. Plus, if you got a credit card, be happy, don't mess it up with heatsink compounds. Now, regarding the installation of the cooler, As you see, this is then the I/O shield part of the motherboard. So this is where the end of the case will be, and this is where there is one of the 14 centimeter fans which is pushing air out of the case. This is why then I'm installing the heatsink such that it will sit like this on top of the CPU. So then the fan will be installed on this side, so it will then push air through, and then it will push the hot air towards this 14 centimeter fan here in the back side of the case. Now you might think that it would be a good idea to install the fan on top of this thing and then install it on the motherboard. Well, the thing is that this is so big that actually you cannot fit the memory modules anymore if you install the heatsink on top of it. So what I will do is that now then I will install this thing mechanically first of all. Then I will insert the memory sticks, and then finally I will put the rear cooler on top of it. To install then this heatsink, we're gonna need then this bracket again, which should have come with your TrueSpirit 140 cooler. And in order to install this bracket, then we're gonna need two of the smaller or shorter screws, which they should have provided with the cooler, which will then be screwed in here in these two screw holes. So to install this thing, then the bracket needs to sit such that this bended part is sitting on top of this heatsink like this. Okay, so yeah, you just put it on top of it and you put it on the top of the CPU. Then I like to slightly move it by hand to the side, so I'm distributing the heatsink compound on the top of the CPU. It is sitting just fine. So this means that we can now align these mounting brackets holes on with these metal things. We can screw in the two screws. So once you have the two screws put in, do not tighten any of the screws, but just screw them in as much as that they are holding the cooler, and then do 2 turns with your screwdriver, then change the side and do this over and over again so that the cooler is really sitting flat on the surface. Because if you tighten one of the screws, then you try to screw the other one, then the cooler will, you know, sit in an angle, and that's no good. You should not tighten these down until, you know, with Kamehameha, like, yeah, with full power. You don't need to be a Super Saiyan. And you should definitely not hear crackling sounds when you are screwing this down, because that means that you are completely bending the whole motherboard.